This series of videos is being created to remind the world of the 100-year era between when the Civil War ended and the Civil Rights Movement came to pass. Most of these stories are gruesome, despicable, and horrific, but they need to be told in order for certain critics of present-day political agendas to have an accurate representation of what life was like for blacks after slavery. Too often there's an almost purposeful ignorance, a contempt for those of color, and a stain on the true horrors that African Americans faced daily. A life without justice, a life of oppression, a life without safety. These are their stories. We have all heard the story of Rosa Parks and how this courageous woman refused to move to the back of the bus. We've been told since our grade school days that her actions on December 1st of 1955 were what ultimately began churning the wheels of the civil rights machine. While this incident definitely fueled a surge of activism to emerge across the nation, it was perhaps another story that happened only 3 months prior to Rosa Parks that ultimately inspired the bulk of the civil rights agenda. That story is the story of 14-year-old Emmett Till. Emmett Till was born on July 25, 1941, in Chicago, Illinois, to Louis and Mamie Till. Right around Emmett's second birthday, Till's father Louis joined the ranks to fight in World War II, but he never returned home. After his father died, Emmett's mother Mamie gave him all that remained of Louis, which was a gold ring with the inscription, May 25, 1943, LT. Mamie sought the help of her mother in raising young Emmett at this point, since she was now a single mother herself. For the next 10 years, Emmett made friends at school, and he was becoming a young man. His friends at McCosh Elementary School in Chicago recalled that Emmett was always one to make other students laugh, and that his personality was captivating. One such friend, Richard Hurd, recalled that Emmett used to lift his shirt up to expose his chubby abdomen, and who would make his belly roll in waves of fat.
He was, like you say, a harmless guy. Fun-loving, liked to laugh.
The other students would laugh to the point of tears, and Emmett seemed happy to hear the laughter. Not only was he a funny student, but he was also a responsible one with a bright future, and he was always in the highest of spirits. In the summer of 1955, Emmett was invited to visit the home of his great-uncle down in Mississippi. His mother, Mamie, had her reservations, but she decided to trust her son and began to give him warnings of how the South is different than the North. She explained that in Mississippi, a black child or adult should always move off the sidewalk and put their head down if a white person is walking toward them. She also told him that he is only to address whites as sir or ma'am, and under no circumstance should he ever talk to a white woman. With apprehension, she watched her son board the train bound for her hometown down south. It was the last time she saw Emmett alive. Just 2 weeks after arriving at his Uncle Moses' house in the small town of Money, Mississippi, Emmett and a handful of his cousins went to Bryant's grocery store on the far end of town after a day of cotton picking for some spending money. The store was owned by Roy and Carolyn Brandt, and Mrs. Brandt was the one working on this specific day. While the complaint and fabricated story of Carolyn has only recently been exposed as completely exaggerated, the encounter has been the subject of scrutiny for over 70 years. The one specific error that can be agreed upon by both parties is that while Emmett was in the store buying bubble gum from the owner's wife, he whistled at her. In an apparent caution to the wind moment, Carolyn became enraged, stormed out of the store, and began walking to her car, supposedly to fetch a gun. The boys became understandably spooked and ran off in fear of what type of consequence was to come their way. For 3 days, they sat terrified of what was going to happen and when. But by the 4th day, nothing had come of the incident, and the young group of teens foolishly let their guard down. On the 4th night, the evening of August 28, 1955, Emmett was asleep upstairs at his great-uncle's house when 2 white men drove up the driveway in the middle of the night. Roy Brandt, Carolyn's husband and owner of the store, along with his half-brother, J.W. Milam, approached the house with flashlights, baseball bats, and guns in hand. After banging on the door, Emmett's great-uncle Mose opened it to see the men standing there, ready to attack the 14-year-old child.
About 2:30, I heard a voice at the door, and I asked who was it, and they said, "This is Mr. Bryant. I want to talk with you and the boy."
J.W. Milan then asked Mose how old he was, to which Mose replied, "64, sir." J.W. responded by saying, "You won't turn 65 if you tell anyone about this."
The noise, they, woke me up. And this guy with the pistol told me to lay back down and go to sleep. And it took me a while to figure out what was going on.
When they marched him to the door, they opened the door and got to the car. Near to the car, they asked the question, "Is this the right one?" And I heard a boy say yes. And they drove off toward money with him.
At that, the white men drug a crying and terrified Emmett out of the house, and he was thrown into the vehicle. Emmett's uncles and cousins watched the car drive off into the night, with fear still gripping the entire household. Several hours passed, and Emmett had not returned home. His uncle later told the court that he knew as soon as the sun rose on the fields that day that he would never see his nephew again. In his grief, he called Emmett's mother Mamie and told her what had taken place. Though the police were immediately notified, only a report had been written and no investigation had been instigated by the authorities. 3 days passed when 2 boys who were fishing along the banks of the Tallahatchie River noticed something odd in the water. As they approached something that seemed to be floating on the surface of the river, they realized it was the feet and legs of someone being held down by what looked like a large metal wheel. They quickly reported this to their parents, who involved the police. When the police arrived, they removed a 75-pound metal fan blade that was attached to Emmett's neck with loops of barbed wire, and they removed his badly beaten corpse from the river. Emmett had been beaten so badly that his face was completely unrecognizable. Once the body was released back to Chicago for burial, Mamie went to see the corpse of her only child. The body had been delivered to the morgue in a wooden box that had been purposefully nailed shut. Mamie demanded that the box be opened so that she could see her charismatic young Emmett and to see what he endured during the murder. Later, Mamie described to reporters that she began the viewing by starting at his feet and working her way up the legs to the torso. She said she'd noticed deep gashes or stab wounds on his legs, several areas that looked as though the bones were broken, and she said his genitals had been completely cut off. She then said he had gashes and pieces of bone sticking out of his abdomen and ribs, and she saw that he had broken fingers on his hands as well. On one of those fingers was his father's ring, still inscribed, May 25th, 1943, LT. As she made her way up to his face, Mamie knew that what she was about to see was never going to leave her mind, but she said she felt she had to stay strong so that she could tell Emmett's story in court. When her eyes met his neck, she first noticed his tongue. Emmett's tongue had been removed entirely and then shoved back into his mouth. She said his cheeks and mouth were bloated and swollen beyond recognition, and his nose looked as though it had been beaten with a meat hammer. One of his eyes had popped out of its socket and was laying on its mangled cheek, while the other eye appeared to be completely absent. She then noticed a hole in Emmett's head above his temple. His ear was gone, but past that hole, she could see through to the other side and saw daylight. She couldn't believe that he was shot in the head on top of every other brutality he had suffered. At the top of Emmett's head was a large gash that spanned the entire length of the scalp. The mortician later explained to her that this was the site that the murderers began to skin Emmett alive by pulling the skin away from the cranium and down towards the chin. Apparently, his killers did not complete this part of the murder and simply pulled the facial skin back up before tying his neck with barbed wire and the metal fan blade as they dumped him in the river carelessly. The mortician asked Mamie if she wanted an open casket. She was faced with the most heinous version of her son for burial, but her brave response was, "Yes, I want the world to see what they did to my baby." Mamie later explained that she needed the public to see Emmett's disfigured face because she knew that no one could ever possibly believe that a human being could be that evil to a child. Her decision in this moment was one that eventually led to over 50,000 people viewing his mangled face, according to the Smithsonian Institute record. This decision, despite how undeniably difficult, truly spurred the actions of tens of thousands of African Americans to begin standing up for the injustices of the Jim Crow South. After the world learned of Emmett Till's death, a trial began. Because voting rights for blacks were stifled in the state of Mississippi, an all-white jury, a white judge, white attorneys, and a white audience went to trial. Despite the obvious evidence, Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam were found not guilty. It took the jury only 50 minutes to reach a verdict. However, one juror later stated that they had made up their minds in the first 5 minutes, but they'd stalled while drinking soda pop so that it wouldn't seem so obvious. Within just 4 months after the trial, the two killers sold their story to a magazine, and since they cannot be tried for the same crime twice, their confession to the editors was able to be told in great detail. Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam admitted to everything and explained precisely how they killed the 14-year-old child. Never once in all the years that passed did either man ever show the slightest remorse for the murder. Roy Bryant died of cancer in August of 1994, almost 40 years after he committed one of the nation's most brutal inhumanities of the century. His half-brother J.W. Milam died of bone cancer 13 years prior. Despite giving a full account of their crimes, neither man ever spent a single day in custody for their heinous actions. Until the day he died, Roy Bryant refused to talk about the case after he confessed for the money all those years ago. Carolyn Bryant never spoke about her lies during the trial. She confessed to the judge that Emmett had touched her, flirted with her, and was being provocative towards her. However, near the end of her life, Carolyn finally admitted that this was all a lie. She said the only thing that took place was that Emmett whistled at her. Emmett's mother, Mamie Till, spent her life speaking out against Jim Crow-era trials and injustices of the system that failed her son. Mamie kept his memory alive by publicly telling his tale and bringing to light the racial inequalities of America. She died on January 6th of 2003. At one of her last speaking engagements, she said, "With each day, I give thanks for the blessings of life, the blessings of another day, and the chance to do something with it, something good, something significant, something helpful. No matter how small it might seem, I want to keep making a difference."